with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, special sessions of the legislature are becoming less special every time a new one convenes, such as this week. At issue is the budget, and the consequences could be dire. Elsewhere, New Orleans was awarded another Super Bowl in the same week when the new mayor expressed concern about drainage in the city, where the below sea level topography is itself a Super Bowl. We'll be looking at these stories as well as the gambling industry wanting to expand, Texas wanting our corporations, and the council wanting to take another look at short-term rentals. In session for us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Kevin McGill, reporter, Associated Press; Kathy Finn, freelance business writer; and Kevin Litton, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. And we go to Kevin first. And oh, this is the season when we really are thinking about drainage issues. I mean, in the metro area and certainly within the city of New Orleans. And we just saw this, last Friday with this sudden downpour, streets flooding. So what's the new mayor's take on this? How do we tackle these drainage issues in the city?
Well, the mayor has only been in office for 2 weeks, and this flood that we just had really came quickly for her. And I think her first reaction, took people by surprise a little bit, because she said right away, this is a city that floods. And I think a lot of people listened to that and they thought, well, are we just waving the white flag, or are we just going to say, well, that's something that we're going to have to deal with? So the mayor then called another press conference on Tuesday, a few days after, so that she could kind of talk honestly about some of the issues. And, she did not backtrack on that issue. She said that, we have a lot of things that we can do, and we have plans that we can put in place. But for right now, flooding is going to be an issue, and she just encouraged residents to be patient with her administration, work together in their neighborhoods to clean out their drains, and, pointed out that all of the pumps were pretty much working. We are in a much better place than we were last August. So look, it's going to flood whether the drains are at high capacity or not.
Whether all the pumps are working or not. I mean, considering what happened last Friday, there was an enormous amount of rainfall in a short amount of time. I mean, several inches. I believe in Jefferson Parish it was almost 6 inches in about an hour. So that will tax any kind of drainage system, but still, people want to be reassured. They're paying for this service, and it's really important to the people who live in the city, who come visit the city, that the streets stay dry. So what are they supposed to feel hearing, well, the city's going to flood?
I think that's right, and I think another thing to think about too is you want businesses to come here and invest. And with the comments that she made, I think people listened to that and they said, well, is she saying, maybe you shouldn't invest here? She's saying, I'm not saying that. She's saying, look at the plans that we have in place and let's try to work together on this. My question for her was, after she went back to this urban water plan, which came out in 2013, she cited that water plan several times, but the water plan involves a lot of green infrastructure, which is expensive to build. Now, what we haven't talked about from a policy perspective so far is how to pay for that. She talked a lot about kind of blaming the former administration for not getting design work done on some of that green infrastructure. But the reality is much of that funding for that green infrastructure comes from FEMA. It's a one-time source. So the big question going forward is, where are we going to come up with the revenue to build infrastructure that is going to be able to support this? One thing to keep in mind about this is the most expensive thing that we could possibly do is expand that capacity of the actual drains and the pumps. That's really expensive. The urban water plan says we can't pump our way out of this. And in fact, the city may be sinking more because we're pumping so much. So this idea of a stormwater fee is a policy that just hasn't been discussed yet. The council could take it up. The mayor could take the lead on it, but she wasn't really ready to do that on Tuesday.
But are we getting close to that time? Climate change, sea level rise, changing atmosphere, a lot more heavy rainfall. Is this something that folks in this area, particularly for the drain, for that fee you're talking about, you're referring to in the urban water plan. That's not just the city of New Orleans. That's the few parishes involved with that.
Yeah, that's another piece that has to be part of the discussion. You need cooperation between Jefferson and St. Bernard. Everybody's going to have to pay into that. The infrastructure would benefit all three parishes. So the question I have then is this something that we can all cooperate with between the three parishes? Is this something that has to go up to Baton Rouge and the legislature has to take action? Clearly, I mean, I think the leadership in each of the three parishes are going to have to start thinking about this, as are the legislative bodies.
Kevin, when you talk about the urban water plan, some people may not understand what that is. Could you just quickly elaborate that this would create certain parts of the city where water accumulates?
Yeah, that's right. Some of it
Part of
involves some of it involves parks where you would build underground cisterns that could actually hold some water during that time. Some of it would be putting in permeable pavement onto sidewalks, roads. Some of it would actually have some examples of floating roads where the water could accumulate underneath. And then some of it is just trying to encourage people to install certain infrastructure on their own homes. You could put in rain barrels, you could put in green roofs. Some jurisdictions offer, for instance, discounts on rain barrels that you can pick that up, hook that into your gutter, and then it's going into the rain barrel instead of going out into the storm system.
And there's an area in Gentilly that's being targeted for
Mirabeau water
for an area.
That's right. And I mean, the mayor did talk a lot about incentives. How do we incentivize people to do this? But you are going to need that stormwater fee in place to be able to get the discounts on the rain barrels, to be able to encourage people to say, look, if you put in that green roof, you can get a credit on your stormwater fee and you won't have to pay as much as your neighbor.
So she referred to it. Does it seem like she is really moving closer to strongly embracing this type of plan?
Well, she did talk about the plan a lot that day. What she didn't want to talk about was the fee. But I would say that during the campaign, she said that she thought that it was something that needed to be talked about. I think one selling point on it is that this fee could apply to nonprofits and people that aren't really paying property taxes now. So you would have a much larger base to charge this fee. So it would be spread out among more users. That would maybe bring the costs down, but clearly, I mean, for any politician, it's tough to talk about raising fees when we're already paying a lot on our sewage and water bills.
So a conversation that will continue into the future. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Over to Kathy. Texas has not only desired a couple of companies, they've wooed them over. So which ones have gone over there?
Well, mainly we're talking recently about Tidewater and Smoothie King, both announcing that they're shifting their headquarters over there to Houston. But it's not unusual. It's not anything that's really new. The oil industry, in particular, has been kind of leaking off to Houston, so to speak, for a long time. And it's not really a particular phenomenon. Nothing has really changed. What it is Houston has always been an industry hub for the oil and gas industry, larger than New Orleans. Obviously, it's a much larger city than New Orleans, and the industry has deep roots in Houston. And they've always been a center of many of the producers, the Exxons, the BPs, and all those. So the real production companies have long been in Houston. We had Shell, of course, in One Shell Square, and they were the largest of the industry in New Orleans for many years. But even there, look what's happened in the last year as jobs have leaked over to Houston out of Shell. One Shell Square is not going to be One Shell Square anymore. It's going to be named after a bank, and that should happen later this year. But usually by the time the public hears about these things, most of the jobs have already been drawn away and they've already moved. And I think that's the case in Tidewater, for instance. Tidewater, of course, has had a lot of financial difficulties in the past couple of years. They went into bankruptcy and out of bankruptcy. And I know that some of those jobs were moving all along the way, because their office space in Pan American Life Center has been, decreasing, and I think a lot of that space has been sublet. So, and that's what happens. You don't hear about the real officially until a lot of that is already gone.
But it is pretty painful to hear of a company that started here in Louisiana, in the early 20th century, is now going to be moving its base of operations to Texas.
And I think, I'm sorry, yeah, I think.
Well, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think with Tidewater is part of the service industry, the oil field service industry, that it's always been, really had deep roots here in the New Orleans, South Louisiana in general. And if they go to Houston, they are closer to those users. You know, the relationships they already have over there just get stronger and stronger. It doesn't mean that the service industry is going to leave South Louisiana necessarily. It's just kind of a natural progression, especially when you've had the pressure on pricing, oil prices that you've had over the past few years, even though they've recovered a lot lately.
But the Texas cities like Houston and Dallas have a lot of land, so they can
Right.
develop these little suburban towns they're the market towns. But they can also build really, really, really big airports. In those airports, they've been able to build international airports. We're an international airport, sort of. I mean, maybe there's 4 or 5 nonstop international destinations. They have a lot, and especially for a place like Smoothie King, which is developing an Asian business, that it's really a convenient thing, like to be in Dallas or Houston and to be able to fly to Asia. Whereas in New Orleans, you'd probably have to go to Atlanta or one of those places, and so that makes a big difference.
It does, and there's a critical mass of business in Houston that does not exist in New Orleans when it comes down to it. And Smoothie King, of course, is also one that was it was native to New Orleans. It was founded here, even though the owners sold it some time ago, and that owner. He actually had talked about leaving some time ago. That was before they took the naming rights to the arena, Smoothie King Center, which I think we will retain for the rest of the contract, which I think maybe runs through 2024 or something like that.
Well, the news that we would prefer hearing is that companies are moving
We
here,
don't like
not
to hear
moving-
that,
yeah.
but we've got some coming in too, as we've
Right.
talked about before here. So.
All right, Kathy, thanks a lot. Over to Kevin. On the end, Kevin McGill. Legislature, okay, they're back at it again for another special session.
Yeah, another special session. This one at least started off differently than the others. Whether it's going to end up any differently is the big question. It started off differently in that it didn't start with a speech by the governor to the legislature. It started with a speech by the governor to folks at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And he followed up the following day, the second day of the session, with a speech to a rally of employees of some of the what we used to call charity hospitals, the safety net hospitals. He's concentrating, trying to drum up grassroots support for more revenue in front of the audiences that are going to be affected most: higher education on Tuesday, and then the health care, the hospitals on Wednesday. I also got a sign Wednesday that there's still a lot of enmities left over from the first special session where no revenue was raised, and the second, well, the regular session where the budget that was put together by legislators who said they didn't like it, who said it was even a pretend budget, and it was vetoed by the governor because it mostly funded health care, made major cuts to higher education. It was ultimately vetoed. The bitterness kind of leaked over Wednesday morning into the Ways and Means Committee hearing, where they basically just discussed different measures, but they didn't vote on any, as far as I can remember. And then Thursday, it became clear again how difficult it's going to be for John Bel Edwards to get the kind of revenue he wants. Background: $1.4 billion worth of taxes that were passed temporarily go off the books on July 1st. The governor believes, and there is some consensus among some legislators anyway, that the state needs about $600 million to $650 million of those to stay on, or there are going to be major cuts to health care and or higher education. Thursday morning, the Ways and Means Committee had a long hearing on what they call House Bill 11, which was a measure that would at least preserve about a half-cent of the sales tax, the 1 cent sales tax that's supposed to go off the books. There were a lot of exemptions. There was a lot of debate, and that failed on, I think it was an 11-6 vote in the Ways and Means Committee. Other bills that raise maybe half, maybe even less than half of that, stand a better chance of at least getting to the floor. But it's going to be a couple of weeks before we know how this is going to shape up. And of course, we still have to. The legislature still has a budget to pass, and that's still in the Appropriations Committee. But I don't know which is going to move farther. Whether they'll get a budget that they can hang the revenue on, or they will see how much revenue they get.
So the special session is a 2-week session, is that correct?
It's a 2-week session.
And
It is
convened this past Tuesday.
Yeah.
We must have a budget by July 1st.
By July 1st, and any later than June 4th is going to start causing problems for state agencies anyway, as I would guess, in that they've got a plan and they don't know what to plan with. It's not inconceivable at all that we could reach June 1st and still not have a budget or not have a budget or have a budget that makes some really tough cuts here and there to either higher education or health care. The problem is that it takes 2/3 vote in the House and Senate to raise revenue. And in the Senate, it might be doable, but in the House, there's some deep divisions. It looks like there are going to be three factions, basically, some hardcore anti-tax people, some Republicans who are willing to raise some revenue, but to get the 70 votes, they're going to need Democrats. And the Democrats want to raise a lot more, give the governor a lot more of what he wants. So getting that 70 vote consensus is going to be difficult.
You know, if you increase property tax or income tax, people notice that. It seems to me you keep a half penny on the sales tax and no one even notices.
Yeah, you would think, and well, people do notice in that, for instance, the Legislative Black Caucus are people who represent, some rural representatives probably as well. It's considered a regressive tax, and it hurts poor people, low-income people more, which is
the
why
people it hurts the most would also be the most hurt by cutting back health care and education.
Absolutely, and I think that's why what you're looking at right now is, I mean, there's no talk that I've heard about like bringing back the income tax brackets that were cut a few years ago during the general administration. It's all sales tax talk right now.
I think what I've been struck by a lot in this session is the amount of PR that's really been focused on this. Americans for Prosperity have a campaign going right now where they're calling out legislators by name who they think may take tax votes. You had the governor at University of Louisiana, as you mentioned, and the governor's also putting full-bore push onto voters to call their legislators and say, please take these tax votes. We don't want to lose our health care and our education.
Right, you can see what happened if the cuts happen. Okay, well, we'll keep talking about it, and hopefully we'll have something to report in the days and weeks to come. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Over to Errol. Super Bowl is coming back to the city.
Yeah, you know, it used to be that the Super Bowl, the awarding of the Super Bowl was this big contentious battle where cities would go and they would bid against each other, as happened the last time when New Orleans bid. But they've changed the procedure now. I'm not sure why, but it's certainly a lot cleaner and a lot easier procedure. Essentially, there were two cities that got Super Bowls last week. One was Phoenix. They got the Super Bowl in 2023, and New Orleans got it in 2024. Both of them weren't contested. And so I think it was kind of known beforehand that this was the favorite city. So unless they made a major mistake in their presentation, they went there pretty much known. And of course, the cities know what the NFL wants. The NFL knows what it wants, and so it's not like there are any surprises. But listening to some of the commentary on it, what seems to happen is that there are certain cities. Well, first of all, everybody knows that New Orleans is the best city for a Super Bowl. I mean, if we rule the world, it should just be New Orleans all the time. But being that other people got a nose in, okay, that there are certain cities that are the favorite Super Bowl cities: New Orleans, Miami, maybe a West Coast city, and they're gonna always be part of the rotation. But then what happens is that every so often another city builds a new stadium. And when you get a new stadium, that's part of your reward for getting a new stadium, which is why Minneapolis had the Super Bowl last year, and why Atlanta's going to have the one coming up. And so what seems to be is this rotation among the favorite cities, stopping every so often to allow a new city, even if it's in the frozen north like Minneapolis, to have a Super Bowl just because they have a new stadium. And that's the sort of rotation that we're going to have. But for all reasons, New Orleans is the favorite destination. And, I mean, the Superdome is a good place to have it. It's compact. It's downtown. You know, when the Saints played in the Super Bowl in Miami, there was stories. I mean, like people, staying in a hotel in one part of town and having to take a taxi, way across town to another place. Everything is compact in New Orleans. Now, another part of this is
we're
that
going to have to make it quick.
Okay. Another part is that there's talk about maybe this could encourage more state financing to do even more improvements to the Super Bowl. So that might happen to the Superdome. Yeah. So that might happen between around 2022. But things have to get better with the state for that to happen.
Okay, but it's coming in 2024, so that's a good thing. All right, thanks a lot, Errol. Kevin, City Council is taking a look at short-term rentals again. Real hot topic.
Yes, and what's so interesting, I think, about this is how much the momentum has really shifted towards the people that oppose short-term rentals. By the time the City Council started debating the ordinance, they had 7 people signed on to the ordinance as co-authors, which means they're all going to vote for it. So you got a 7-0 passage of an ordinance that basically bans short-term rentals in most of our core residential areas. Those areas in the Bywater, the Marigny, stretching over to Lower Garden, all the way uptown and into Mid-City. Areas like Lakeview are exempted, and the commercial zones are exempted. But this is quite a lot. This is 72% of short-term rental listings are going to be affected by this.
So, clarification here. Is this like full house rentals or only full house rentals? Or if someone's just renting a room, is that also not going to be renewed if you have a permit to do that? All of that is going to be on hold?
Yeah, so the way it works is you don't have really anything to worry about if you're an owner-occupied house and you're renting out a room, or maybe you're renting out half of your double. If you're not occupying the whole home, then you're not going to be able to renew your license. So that would occur over the next year, because each of these licenses are a year. Now, if you are in a zone that's considered a commercial zone, then that is pretty much going to stay unlimited as it was. They were thinking maybe we don't do any new in commercial, but then they added an amendment on that said, no, we're going to allow both new and renewals in the commercial zones. The only exception is that you can't put a short-term rental on a first floor multifamily building. So the commercial zones stay pretty much the way they are, but look, these neighborhoods that's where a lot of this opposition is coming from, because people are tired of the parties, they're tired of not having neighbors, and they're tired of seeing housing prices go up. I mean, I've talked to lots of people who have been out house hunting, and the rapid fire outbidding that occurs on these properties because of investor interest in short-term rentals is really remarkable. We've got a housing crisis that's caused by a housing affordability crisis that's caused by other things, but short-term rentals have really kind of become the picture of, the one that everybody thinks of.
The council has said, well, this has been the plan from the get-go. It's like, we're going to see what it's like, then we're going to have to take a step back, see how it's going, maybe put a hold on it, and sort of tweak it a little bit. So they say this was in the plan.
Yeah, well, they didn't say that this was in the plan when they voted on it. They said that they were open to changing it. I think this is a pretty dramatic turn to take so many of the short-term rental listings in the neighborhood out of commission basically by the end of next year. I think what we're going to look ahead to is they've also put a time limit on this moratorium of 9 months, and what they want to do is they want to have within that 9 months they want to have a study completed, which would be done in September, and then they're going to start looking at regulations that I think are going to be quite different than what we see now. One thing that they're talking about, licensing the platforms, that would create a situation where the platforms are going to be under much more pressure to comply with enforcement. A lot of other things are going to be in that proposal that I think other cities have gotten in place, but they had not gotten in place at the time we passed ours.
Is the city finding that it's hard to enforce?
Extremely hard to enforce, especially this 90-day cap, which was supposed to, make it a little bit less desirable to put it in the neighborhoods. That's where the 90-day cap was in place. They've not figured out a good way to enforce it. I've barely seen any enforcement of that, and we've had the regulations in place for over a year. So the onus, I think, is going to eventually be on the platforms to try to get the platforms to say, look, you need to be more proactive about taking down illegal licenses. You need to be more helpful in sharing the data so that we can enforce effectively.
Okay, we'll see how this one moves along. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Sure. Kathy, gambling definitely has been trying to expand in the state of Louisiana, and certainly in this region.
Mm-hmm. No question. I wrote a column about this for New Orleans Magazine recently, and I did it because I was surprised at how many gambling bills popped up in the legislature, at the opening, right at the opening, because all of a sudden there was this push, and I suspect that probably it was lobbyists who all realized that there's competition from other states, and they thought, well, this is the year we're going to push for things like make the riverboat casinos land-based and that sort of thing. At the time I wrote it, I hadn't even learned yet about Harrah's push. I did know about the hotel that they were proposing to build above the entrance to the casino there. But then Harrah's, the whole controversy came up about the change of ownership of Harrah's, and where did that fit in? They were looking for a 30-year extension of their license in the city, and which is a huge deal. It's a huge deal, and it just seemed to come out of nowhere. So the push for gambling expansion or solidification, you might say, was really surprising and big in the past legislative session. Now that plan for Harrah's, of course, failed, the 30-year extension, and I think largely because when lawmakers found out about the change, the possible or probable change in ownership that they did not know about when the bills were written, I think that kind of turned people off a lot.
Yeah, opponents feared that the state wasn't going to get the money that it should get. Out of
Well,
that deal.
obviously, a 30-year extension would really affect the value of that property. And so from an investor standpoint, there was a lot to be gained from having that extension in their pocket. And so, but the lawmakers didn't know it. You know, it's clearly a material thing that was not disclosed to the lawmakers. So
Okay, but riverboat, because I
but
want you to
meanwhile,
touch
the
on that.
riverboats did get, they were approved to go land-based, basically, and that they can move on land. The only surprising thing about this is how long it took for this to happen. I think everybody knew back in '93 or so when the bill was passed, these guys are eventually going to get their way and be on land, and they don't have to sail and all of that. And so now it's going to happen for sure. And again, I think the only surprising thing is how long it took for this
Which is
to
all the
happen.
more reason why Harris is going to need some concessions, because it used to be alone on being land-based, and now everybody else is moving in.
I mean, the riverboats really been de facto land-based for a long time, so I don't think it changes the picture all of that much. But as I said, I think there was a lot of lobbying behind the scenes. One part of the industry knew what the other was doing, and they said, let's jump on this now and get it done.
Yeah, the riverboats were in pretty quick order, short order. They didn't have to sail. So they,
Right.
like you said, de facto became land-based.
right.
Okay, it's time to look ahead. 8.
The building across from the Superdome, known as the Freeport McMoran building, is no longer by that name. It has now been renamed to the DXC Technology Building. And speaking of 2024, the year of the Super Bowl, they promised to have hired 2,000 people by then.
Very good. All right, Kevin.
Hopefully, maybe by early
At the
next
end.
week. This Kevin. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
okay.
Hopefully by early next week, we will have a little better picture of how much revenue, if any, might come out of the legislative session.
Hopefully, we will have a better idea. I mean, everybody really sort of needs to know now.
It
Getting
may
close
stay
to
up
that,
in the air
that
for
need to have a budget.
till the deadline, but we'll
Okay.
see.
All right, Kevin. Thank you. Kathy.
We're going to hear more about extension of the Lafitte Greenway. There was a campaign that kicked off this week to kind of finish it out and to the north from the extension from where it is right now. There's been a lot of development that's occurring or has occurred along the lower part of the Greenway or the mid-city area. This is a new push, and I think the Greenway is going to be successful, and people see that, and they think, let's get this done if we can do it now.
Okay, Kathy. Thanks. Kevin.
I think with short-term rentals passing, what we're going to look at, the next turn on this is going to be, what is going to be the next, what is the agenda going to look like for housing overall in the city? LaToya Cantrell taking office, she has not really said much. I think the council heard a lot about housing today. The governor, we could know by next week whether he's going to veto a bill that would make it illegal to force developers to build affordable housing in their projects. So that's what I'm looking for, especially if there's a governor veto next week.
Very interesting issue. Okay, thanks a lot, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and we hope it's a dry one. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.